America and Iran weren't always enemies. In fact, there was a time when the United States helped shape Iran's political future in ways that were meant to secure stability, but ultimately ignited decades of hostility. To understand why these two countries remain locked in tension today, you have to go back to 1953 when Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. He made one decision that alarmed Western powers. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking control away from foreign companies that had dominated it for decades. For Iranians, this was a reclaiming of national wealth. For Britain, and increasingly the United States, it threatened energy supplies and Cold War strategy. What happened next was one of the most consequential covert operations of the 20th century. Intelligence agencies from the US and Britain orchestrated a coup that removed Mossadegh and restored the monarchy under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. From Washington's perspective, it prevented potential Soviet influence. From Iran's perspective, it destroyed a democratic government and replaced it with a ruler backed by foreign power. This moment didn't just change leadership, it changed how millions of Iranians viewed America. Under the Shah, Iran transformed rapidly. Oil revenues fueled modernization projects, military expansion, and urban development. Tehran became one of the most Western-aligned capitals in the Middle East. American companies invested heavily, and Iran purchased enormous quantities of U.S. weapons. On the surface, the country looked prosperous and stable. But beneath that progress was an authoritarian system maintained by surveillance and repression. Political opposition was crushed, dissenters were imprisoned, and a powerful secret police apparatus monitored society. Many citizens felt modernization was happening without political freedom, and that national identity was being reshaped to serve external interests. To U.S. policymakers, the Shah represented stability in a volatile region. To many Iranians, he represented a regime sustained by foreign backing rather than popular consent. This contradiction between outward success and internal resentment created pressure that would eventually erupt. By the late 1970s, that pressure reached a breaking point. Mass protests swept across Iran, uniting students, workers, religious groups, and secular activists against the monarchy. At the center of this movement was a cleric who had spent years in exile, Ruhollah Khomeini. When he returned in 1979, millions greeted him as a symbol of resistance. Within months, the Shah fled the country and the monarchy collapsed. What followed was not a liberal democracy, but an Islamic republic governed by religious authority. Anti-Western sentiment became central to the new state ideology, fueled by memories of foreign interference. Later that same year, revolutionary students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking dozens of American diplomats hostage. For 444 days, the crisis dominated global attention. In the United States, the images of blindfolded hostages and chanting crowds created a lasting perception of Iran as a hostile power. In Iran, the takeover was framed as a defensive act against possible foreign plots. Diplomatic relations were severed, and they have never fully recovered. The hostage crisis hardened attitudes on both sides and triggered sweeping economic sanctions from Washington. These sanctions would expand over time into one of the most extensive pressure campaigns ever imposed on a nation. Tensions escalated further during the 1980s when Iran became locked in a devastating war with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Although the United States did not directly enter the conflict against Iran, it provided intelligence and support to Iraq. For Iranian leaders, this confirmed the belief that Washington sought to weaken or overthrow their government. Maritime clashes, attacks on oil tankers, and confrontations in the Persian Gulf added new layers of hostility. Each incident reinforced the narrative on both sides that the other could not be trusted. In the decades that followed, the conflict evolved rather than disappeared. By the early 2000s, global attention shifted to Iran's nuclear program. Iranian officials insisted it was intended for peaceful energy production. The United States and its allies feared it could lead to nuclear weapons development, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Middle East. Years of negotiations, sanctions, and international inspections followed. In 2015, a breakthrough emerged in the form of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement that limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Supporters argued it reduced the risk of war. Critics argued it only delayed the problem. When the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and reinstated sanctions, tensions surged again, demonstrating how fragile diplomatic progress can be when trust is scarce. Beyond direct disputes, the rivalry also plays out through regional influence. Iran supports political movements and armed groups across the Middle East, positioning itself as a counterweight to Western presence and rival powers. The United States maintains military bases and alliances throughout the same region, viewing Iran's actions as destabilizing. This indirect competition means the two countries rarely fight each other directly, but frequently clash through proxy conflicts and strategic maneuvering. Each side interprets its actions as defensive while viewing the other's moves as aggressive, creating a cycle where fear fuels escalation. Despite decades of hostility, full-scale war has been avoided. Both nations understand that direct conflict could destabilize the global economy, disrupt energy supplies, and trigger wider regional warfare. Instead, the relationship exists in a state of persistent tension punctuated by crises. Missile strikes, naval incidents, cyber operations, and political confrontations that flare up and then subside. This pattern creates uncertainty not only for the region, but for the entire world. Public perception deepens the divide. In the United States, political discourse often portrays Iran primarily as a security threat. In Iran, official narratives emphasize resistance against foreign domination and cultural preservation. Generations have grown up internalizing these views, making reconciliation increasingly difficult even when leaders signal openness. The conflict becomes self-sustaining. Each hostile act confirms the fears taught by history. More than 70 years after the 1953 coup, the relationship between Iran and the United States remains one of the most consequential rivalries in global politics. It influences energy markets, military strategy, and diplomatic alignments across continents. Yet it is also a case study in how historical decisions can echo across generations. The people living in both countries today did not choose the events that began this cycle, but they continue to live with its consequences. Understanding this conflict requires seeing it not as a single dispute, but as a chain reaction, a series of actions and reactions driven by security concerns, ideology, memory, and power. Ultimately, this story is not just about two governments that oppose each other. It is about how mistrust, once institutionalized, becomes extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. Interventions intended to secure stability can produce long-term instability. Revolutions can redefine national identity for generations. And narratives of victimhood and resistance can harden into permanent worldviews. The real lesson of the U.S. Iran conflict is that history does not simply pass, it accumulates. And until the underlying mistrust is addressed, the tension will continue shaping global affairs far into the future. The question is no longer how this conflict began, but whether it can ever truly end. That if you want more deep, higher attention case studies that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world, make sure to subscribe now, because the stories behind the headlines are far more powerful than the headlines themselves.